Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh is on the path to confirmation.
Are you going to let our democracy die? Are you going to let us go white power?
I will vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh.
Believe women! Believe women! Believe survivors! Believe survivors!
I could not conclude that he is the right person for the court at this time.
And so I say to every American that is hurting tonight, every American that's angry tonight, tomorrow we face a defeat, but we shall not be defeated.
This is New Day Weekend with Victor Blackwell and Christy Ford.
Well, the votes have been counted, the decisions explained now. All that's left is to make it official with the Senate confirmation vote on Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah, the vote's expected at some point later today as protests continue in Washington, around the country, of course. And today's vote ends a political battle that has gripped the political world for weeks. Continued overnight, of course, as Democrats held the Senate floor for debate.
Joining us live from Capitol Hill, CNN congressional correspondent Sunlen Sirfati. Sunlen, so we know essentially where the vote will come down. Now we've got these hours of debate headed until the vote this afternoon. What have we seen overnight and what are we expecting for the rest of the morning?
Well, good morning to you, Victor. There certainly has been so many twists and turns and bitter partisan battles over this confirmation. But as you said, indeed, Republicans do have the votes to confirm Brett Kavanaugh today. And we will see the Senate officially seal the deal this afternoon on the Senate floor when they vote on his final confirmation. Now, key to all of this was when we saw those four key swing senators who went into the day yesterday previously undecided. They revealed their vote, and this is how it breaks down. Two Republicans, Senator Collins and Senator Flake, and one Democrat, Joe Manchin, all announcing that they are going to vote for Brett Kavanaugh, and one sole Republican, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, the sole Republican that will vote against his confirmation. And specifically, the Senators Collins and Murkowski really taking to the Senate floor and explaining and defending their reasons for each of their votes. They came to two very different conclusions. Senator Collins saying she felt in the end there just wasn't sufficient corroboration for one of Kavanaugh's accusers, Christine Blasey Ford, and both said that they really struggled and agonized over this decision. Here's both of them yesterday.
My fervent hope is that Brett Kavanaugh will work to lessen the divisions in the Supreme Court so that we have far fewer 5-4 decisions, and so that public confidence in our judiciary and our highest court is restored.
I believe that Judge Kavanaugh is a good man, but in my conscience, because that's how I have to vote, the end of the day is with my conscience. I could not conclude that he is the right person for the court at this time.
And moments after Senator Susan Collins gave that big floor speech, we saw Red State Democrat Joe Manchin announce his support of Kavanaugh. You're looking there at video of the scene that unfolded outside of his office yesterday, certainly very emotional with a lot of very vocal protests. Now, over here, overnight, the Senate floor was held open overnight, 30 hours of debate. And what that's amounted to is a series of floor speeches. And you're looking at the Senate floor live right now, a series of Senate floor speeches by Democrats really essentially, protesting this confirmation. At the end of the day, though, they will use up all of that time to say their floor speeches. But at the end of the day, it will not change the math here. This is essentially baked into the cake for Brett Kavanaugh, that he will indeed get confirmed by the end of the day. Now, one thing to watch, Christy and Victor, as we're looking at the votes later this afternoon, especially as we're looking at each and every one of these important swing votes, Senator Lisa Murkowski, she will vote no on Kavanaugh, but her vote today will technically be present, and that is something that she's doing out of courtesy for her Republican colleague, Senator Daines from Montana. He is back home in Montana. He is walking his daughter down the aisle today. So basically, their votes cancel each other out. That margin in the end stays the same, and he will indeed get confirmed.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Sunlen Safadi, we appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, joining me now to discuss Errol Lewis, CNN political commentator, political anchor at Spectrum News, and Joey Jackson, CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Good morning.
All right, Errol, let me start with you. And Sunlen started with the twists and turns of this process, and we've used the word unprecedented, for 2.5 years now, every Saturday on this show. But we had a nominee who did a television interview before the vote. He wrote an op-ed on the eve of the cloture vote, the Wall Street Journal. Is this now, do you expect the anomaly, or is this going to be a campaign for the nomination that works?
Well, this is what we've seen, I think, is the transformation of what had been a pretty restrained nomination process in the past. But I see where you're going, Victor. It looks more and more like a political campaign, complete with op-eds, with partisan speeches, with back and forth, and in the style of Trumpian politics. It includes insults, it includes denials, it includes rallies and so forth. And this was not at all what we've seen over the last couple of generations, frankly, of the path to the Supreme Court.
And what does this mean for the court, Joey? We heard from Justice Elena Kagan yesterday talking about the need for the country to look at the court and believe it is impartial, that they're not just 9 politicians wearing robes. Does the campaign potentially for a seat on the court change the court?
You know, it's interesting, Victor, and good morning to you and Errol. I think we have to understand that this is a seismic shift, and the realities are as they are. And let's be clear about this. You'll have a solid conservative bloc on the court, 5-4. And just talking Supreme Court 101, where you have 9 justices, it takes 5 votes. And we've seen a very polarized process getting him here. You just looked and counted the votes, 51-49. What a squeaker. And when you look at the Supreme Court and you look at the tremendous things that they do, responsibilities over issues like abortion, issues of affirmative action, voting rights, immigration, go down the line, transgender, gay, and there's so many things that the court is in charge of. And so when you have that block of 5 votes, irrespective of this bruising confirmation process, the reality is in terms of ideology, it's to the right. And so, you know, look, everyone, and you learn this in law, and it was one of the most frustrating things about law, Victor, but one of the most challenging and good things about the law. If you want to get to a result, you can justify your logic to get there. And we saw that with the 2 senators yesterday coming out on opposite sides of how they'll vote for him. And that's what the Supreme Court does. So I think we're in for a seismic shift moving forward with regard to how the court decides cases.
Errol, there are a lot of the people who protested and are still protesting the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the court, who were thinking of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford yesterday as they heard that Senator Collins would support this nomination. I want everyone to listen to Dr. Ford. This was on September 27th during her testimony.
Once he was selected and it seemed like he was popular and that it was a sure vote, I was calculating daily the risk-benefit for me of coming forward and wondering whether I would just be jumping in front of a train that was headed to where it was headed anyway, and that I would just be personally annihilated.
So, Errol, did she jump in front of that figurative train? And is there any evidence, I mean, short of maybe Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, that her testimony changed any votes?
Well, it may not have changed the votes, and it's heartbreaking, of course, to hear her sort of predict exactly what turned out to be the case. But we should keep in mind that this confirmation process, not just this one, but really all of them, are intended to be a national discussion. This is sort of a hiring not just by the partisan transient members of the Senate, but really by the whole country. And we've had a national discussion. People protested who have never protested before. People got on trains, went to Washington and protested. And that same energy is going to carry over into the November 6th elections and beyond. So just as we saw an unprecedented wave of women go into politics after the Clarence Thomas confirmation battle, I think you're going to see something similar here. And it'll only be over the long term that you can really tell what happened. But certainly for Dr. Ford, exactly what you predicted has come to pass.
You talked about November 6th and beyond. Typically, do these votes stay with politicians? Does it stay with Susan Collins to 2020, to Lisa Murkowski to 2022? I mean, Manchin may have shored up a lead over Morrissey in West Virginia with his support for Brett Kavanaugh. What's the history tell us about 2-4 years down the line for these types of votes?
I can't give you patterns from the past, but I can tell you for Lisa Murkowski, for example, her political support depends on Native Alaskans, and they were very, very explicit that they expected her to vote no. So she was working her local politics. Susan Collins, in 2020, she's got a very different set of political problems. My understanding is that something like $3 million has been raised, and at least 1/3 of that came while she was speaking on the floor explaining her vote. And this is crowdsourced money. There are a lot of people who are not going to forget this, and that money, you know, once the money's in the till and ready to go for her opponent in 2020, that's going to give her a lot to think about as she contemplates whether to seek a 5th term.
Hey, Joey, let me ask you about the American Bar Association. They sent this letter that I have here to Chairman Grassley of Senate Judiciary and Ranking Member Feinstein, in which they write, new information of a material nature regarding temperament during the September 27th hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee has prompted a reopening of the Standing Committee's evaluation. What's the significance here?
You know, I hate to tell you, Victor, but the significance is nil. The fact is that at the end of the letter they said, but our initial evaluation stands as it relates to well qualified. And of course, they say that they won't complete their review until the confirmation process is over. And as we're speaking here, we know that the Senate is gearing up to vote later today. And so, you know, American Bar Association, very important, significant in what they do and how they people, but this is irrelevant. And, you know, it's just going to be interesting moving forward globally. I know we always talk in law about this issue of stare decisis. It has been decided. Precedent. We always in Supreme Court look at precedent, but Supreme Court overrules precedent, and we're going to be looking very closely to see what these members do. And last term, they just overruled a labor decision called Janus, you know, had a direct effect on me and what I do as it relates to, you know, law and labor unions and their ability to sponsor and pay. That is the union for them. And so, look, the reality is that these justices have a vast amount of power. Notwithstanding what law was yesterday, they have the ability to change it today and moving forward. So we are in a new day, to be clear, should he be confirmed, and it certainly looks likely that he will be.
Yeah, sometime this late afternoon, maybe early evening. Joey Jackson, Errol Lewis, thank you both.
Thank you, Victor.
Well, still to come, President Trump silent so far. What will he say to supporters later today in Kansas, now that his second Supreme Court justice is just hours away from confirmation?
Plus, she was mocked by the president after coming forward with an accusation of sexual assault against Kavanaugh. So does Christine Blasey Ford regret her decision? Her lawyer says no.
I don't think she has any regrets. I think she feels like she did the right thing, and this was what she wanted to do.
And guilty. A Chicago jury says a white former police officer did murder a black teenager. His family now calling the conviction a victory for America.
Hi, I just wanted to tell you that Chevy won a J.D. Power Dependability Award for its midsize.
We don't often see this, especially on a Saturday, but this is a momentous weekend for the Senate and the Supreme Court. Judge Kavanaugh will almost certainly join the court after a vote this afternoon, maybe early evening. President Trump may be in Kansas when his second nominee to the nation's highest court is confirmed. He plans a campaign rally in Topeka today. And that brings us to CNN's Joe Johns at the White House. Joe, we haven't really heard a lot from the president since Friday morning and the announcement from Senator Collins that she is a yes.
That's absolutely right. The last time the president tweeted about the nomination was about 19 hours ago. That was a tweet essentially congratulating the Senate for voting to move forward to a final vote on this Kavanaugh nomination. But look, the moment of the week, Victor, quite frankly, obviously came just yesterday when all of Washington stopped to listen to that speech on the Senate floor by Senator Susan Collins of Maine, in which she described her thinking, her reasons, her conclusions, and then saying, of course, that she would vote in favor of the Kavanaugh nomination. All of Washington stopped to watch, including the president, who was in the Oval Office with members of the House and Senate. He was getting ready to sign a bill reauthorizing the Federal Aviation Administration into law for the next 5 years. He asked those members of Congress if they wanted to watch the Susan Collins speech, we're told, and they did. And as you know, it was a long speech, between 45 minutes. The president, at the end of the day, of course, described as in a very good mood, obviously, after hearing the news from Susan Collins, because she essentially puts Republicans over the top for this vote, which is expected in the United States Senate, unless there are any other problems, later today. Now, as you said, the president is expected to be heading off to Topeka, Kansas. He's expected to leave the White House before the vote occurs here in Washington, and he is expected to have that rally in Topeka, Kansas after the vote. So a couple opportunities to hear from the president then. Also important to say, this administration appears to be on a roll right now. They just got a jobs report indicating a 49-year low in unemployment, so that's very big for them. But the truth of it is, the thing that galvanizes voters right now in this last stretch toward the midterms is for the conservatives, for Republicans, the president following through on his promise to get another conservative jurist on the United States Supreme Court. It appears that is going to happen. Still, on the other side, of course, Victor, there is that question of the opposition being energized, and we're expecting that too. We'll see another demonstration today at the Supreme Court against this nomination.
Yeah, big week for the president. Also starting the week off by announcing Canada joined that multilateral trade deal as well. We'll see how much all this means about 30 days from now at the midterm election. Joe Johns at the White House, thanks so much.
CNN political commentator Errol Lewis back with us again. Errol, thanks for sticking around. We haven't heard specifically from the president, of course, except for that tweet that was mentioned. They're very proud of the U.S. Senate for voting yes to advance the nomination. We have heard from Donald Trump Jr., however, and it's been a bit perplexing. I want to read you one of his tweets. A real profile and courage from Lion liberal Joe Manchin. Waited until Kavanaugh had enough votes secured before he announced his support. I bet he had another press release ready to go if Collins went the other way. West Virginia vote MAGA champion Morrissey, West Virginia. So he's got Manchin, the lone Dem, voting yes, voting the way they want him to vote, and he's taken a shot at him. Do you get a sense that Trump Jr. is speaking for his father?
I think you have to always assume that the Trump operation, let's just call it the larger political inner circle, is speaking with one voice, and that voice is that of the president. Look, in this case, there was some speculation going up to the cloture vote the other day that perhaps Senator Manchin had some private deal with the White House. The president was in West Virginia not long ago, did not go out of his way to make over-the-top insults or criticisms of Joe Manchin. The thinking was perhaps there's some kind of implied deal here. The tweet by Donald Trump Jr. suggests that there is no such deal and that they're going to fight tooth and nail. Look, the reality is, if there was anybody among all of those wavering so-called senators who were undecided, Joe Manchin had the most room to maneuver. He's up by close to 10 points in his race. We're only 30 days out. It's clear he could have weathered this, and a negative vote would not have cost him the election or cost him his lead in the polls, which is all we've got right now. So we've got to assume that he did this according to his own merits. He said right up until the last minute he wasn't sure what he's going to do. I don't think Donald Trump Jr.'s speculation really holds much water.
You know, you mentioned people who are on buses, people who are protesting in front of congressmen and congresswomen's law offices. Anger is a great motivator. to get people to the polls. What is President Trump, what are the Republicans going to do to counter the anger that we're seeing?
Well, you know, it's very interesting because what Donald Trump himself does and what we're going to probably see at his rally in Kansas today is very different from what candidates need to do in order to win. So I think you'll see sort of a split reaction. You'll see Donald Trump bombastic, using the full range of insults and talking points that he usually uses at these rallies. And then I think it's a very different question for people who are trying to get themselves elected. You'll notice, I think, and it's a pretty consistent pattern, that the economic argument is not something that Republicans are running on. They're running on culture war issues. They're talking about the Supreme Court. They're talking about everything except the economy, because I think their internal polling is showing that that's not moving their voters, that's not getting their voters excited as much as something like the fight over the Supreme Court. So I think we're going to continue to see this Kavanaugh process, the nomination, and of course the outcome as a very much a front and center consideration for a lot of the candidates, not necessarily the president, but the candidates who are on the ballot this year.
All righty. Errol Lewis, always appreciate your perspective. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Still to come, a Chicago police officer guilty of murder in the death of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. Coming up, the message from that teen's family after this conviction.
Laquan McDonald represents all of the victims that suffered what he suffered across this country.
It is just about 6:30 here on a Saturday morning. So good to have you with us. I'm Christy Paul.
I'm Victor Blackwell. Good to be with you. Judge Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination heads to a final Senate vote later today. Right now, it looks like he is sure to be confirmed, with Senators Collins, Flake, and Manchin deciding to back Kavanaugh.
Senator Lisa Murkowski is the lone Republican who says she opposes the judge, but she will vote present as a gesture to Senator Steve Daines, so he won't have to leave his daughter's wedding, and they essentially cancel each other out.
For weeks, Kavanaugh's confirmation process has been a heated battle on Capitol Hill, with hours of hearings, FBI investigations, allegations of sexual assault. A Chicago police officer is facing decades in prison after being convicted in one of the most closely watched trials in the city's history. Jason Van Dyke was the first Chicago police officer to be charged with first-degree murder since 1980. He was the first to be convicted of murder in an on-duty shooting in nearly 50 years. CNN's Ron Young has the details.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of second-degree murder.
Nearly 4 years after the shooting of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald, a jury found Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke guilty of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery on Friday. The verdict marking a culmination to the racially charged case that became emblematic of decades of tension between Chicago's urban communities and the city's police force. The shooting was captured on a grainy police dash cam video with no audio. Van Dyke told investigators he fired in self-defense after McDonald lunged at him with a knife. The video shows Van Dyke shooting McDonald 16 times. None of the other officers at the scene fired their weapons. It wasn't until 13 months after the incident that a judge ordered the city to release the video.
16 shots and a cover-up!
The video ignited protests, a Justice Department civil rights investigation, criticism of the city's mayor, and eventually the ouster of the police superintendent.
I shot him.
In an unusual move Tuesday, Van Dyke took the witness stand in his own defense.
His face had no expression. His eyes were just bugging out of his head. He had just these huge white eyes just staring right through me.
At times becoming visibly emotional as he alleged the 17-year-old ignored repeated commands to drop his knife before the officer opened fire.
He waved the knife from his lower right side upwards, across his body, towards my left shoulder.
Prosecutors sparred with Van Dyke over discrepancies in his testimony that the teenager raised his knife toward officers, which cannot be seen in the dash cam video.
Have you ever seen Laquan McDonald do that on one of those videos?
The video doesn't show my perspective.
Van Dyke's lawyer says he was not surprised by the verdict and plans to appeal.
If police officers think that they can never fire against somebody that is acting the way Laquan McDonald did, when they're 12 feet away from him. I think that what we are going to have is police officers are going to become security guards.
But for Laquan McDonald's family, they hope this verdict will finally help bring them some closure.
This trial today did two things again. It gave us justice of which we seek, and it also set a precedent across this country.
Van Dyke faces a maximum of 20 years in prison for second-degree murder and 6 to 30 years for each of the 16 aggravated battery convictions. He is scheduled back in court October 31st. Ryan Young, CNN Chicago.
CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney Joey Jackson with us now. Joey, based on what you saw, what happened, what do you prognosticate his sentence would be?
You know, Christy, good morning to you. I think the judge certainly has to serve him up with a significant sentence. Why do I say that? Number one, obviously, when a purpose of sentencing is punishment, and he needs to be punished for that. I mean, I think we all saw the video, and I think we all had a reaction that we had to the video that it was not necessary. Number two, as it relates to deterrence, you certainly want to deter this type of activity. Police certainly have a tough job. We get that. We understand that. We value and appreciate what they do. But when they act unreasonably, as he did, they have to be punished for it, and it has to be known that matters need to be de-escalated where appropriate, and deadly force, should be used as a last alternative, not the first reaction. And so I think by matters of punishment and deterrence, I think the judge has to give him a stiff sentence.
Did they have to put him on the stand, in your opinion?
I think they did. I will not fault the defense in this case, and let me tell you why. I think there were two things that needed to be overcome. Number one, the immediacy of the threat. The only one who could explain whether there was an immediacy of the threat which would justify deadly force is him. You heard him on the stand talk about his perceptions. He's the guy that has to say what he perceived and why he perceived that Laquan McDonald represented a deadly force. Number two, the disproportionate nature of the force used, Christy. He shot 16 times. Most of those shots were when Laquan McDonald was on the ground. Why on earth would you do that? The only one who could explain that was him. And quite frankly, given the nature of the evidence, I just think that it was the only call to make because, he's the only guy who could try to justify it. It did not, at the end of the day, get justified, and I think the jury reached the proper and just result in this case.
Yeah, jurors were saying that he seemed rehearsed in his testimony. And we know that the police union is promising an appeal. On what grounds? There's always, Christy, an appellate issue or two or three or multiple that come out of the trial. The grounds that they're going to rely upon is that the judge did not move the trial out of this particular jurisdiction, given the protest and the heated nature and environment that was there. I just don't know that that carries any weight at the end of the day, particularly nowadays where we're in a society where something could happen in Chicago, it could happen in New York, it could happen in France. We all see it. We all have a reaction to it. And, throughout the course of the trial, certainly there are other issues that came up, but I thought the judge allowed so many things. I think that in this particular case, the defense savaged Laquan McDonald, talking about the PCP found in his system, talking about his troubled past as a youth, bringing in juvenile counselors and talking about how he was disruptive and belligerent. And a lot of times judges don't even allow that. So I think the judge was beyond fair in terms of what he allowed, and I wouldn't, if I were presiding, I'd have allowed half the things that this judge did. So there will be an appeal. I don't see it having, much merit from the evaluation that I've seen of the trial and the multiple witnesses. And I think at the end of the day, Christy, it's the right call. You can't shoot someone 16 times who doesn't appear to pose an imminent threat to you. No other officer on the scene fired. The value of that is that why did you act so differently from your compatriots? Those officers testified saying they didn't seem to share your fear or concern. And so I think it's an uphill battle, to be clear. And I think the second-degree murder result, which was a lesser included, I should add, because he was charged with first-degree murder. The distinction for the viewers briefly is that they felt that he thought that he had lawful justification, that his officer Van Dyke did, but it was unreasonable and unjustified. That made it second-degree murder. I just think it was the right result in this case, and I think justice was served. All righty. Joey Jackson, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Christy.
Always.
The international police agency Interpol has a mystery to solve. Its president is missing. Meng Hongwei of China also holds a top security position in the Chinese government, but Interpol won't say whether Meng was there when he vanished. Now, quoting an unnamed source, the South China Morning Post says Meng was taken away for questioning when he landed in China last week.
Well, Christine Blasey Ford's lawyers say she has no regrets about coming forward with her assault allegations against Judge Brett Kavanaugh. But President Trump's mockery of her testimony at a rally, that has hurt her deeply. We're going to hear from her lawyers and relatives regarding how she's handling the fallout of the confirmation battle now.
The Senate is expected to vote on the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and it's very likely he will be confirmed. But, of course, we heard from Christine Blasey Ford, her accusations that Kavanaugh assaulted her while they were in high school.
We have to be very clear. Kavanaugh denies the accusations, but Ford's sister-in-law says her testimony at the Senate hearing, Ford's testimony, and President Trump's reaction to it at a rally has caused her more pain.
I think when her sexual trauma, involved being laughed at and being helpless, and both of those things have happened. She's been laughed at by the President of the United States with people applauding and laughing. So I can only imagine from what I know about trauma that she is probably feeling a whole host of intolerable, terrible feelings right now.
Now, despite that laughter, Dr. Ford's lawyers say that she has no regrets about testifying, but they are blasting senators for what they call false claims about the FBI investigation into the allegations. CNN's Dana Bash spoke with him earlier.
Have you heard any regrets from her about coming out the way she did? I don't think she has any regrets. I think she feels like she did the right thing, and this was what she wanted to do, which was provide this information to the committee so they could make the best decision possible. And I think she still feels that that was the right thing to do, so I don't think she has any regrets.
If you were to do it all over again, knowing what you know now, could this have been done in a different way with regard to Senator Feinstein, the fact that she didn't tell anybody? She says it was because she was abiding by the wishes of Professor Ford, Congresswoman Eshoo, and so forth. I mean, in retrospect, knowing what you know now, could and should it have been done differently?
I can't speak to the process. What I can speak to is when victims of sexual assault and violence go to their congresspeople, when they go to their senators, and they ask for their information to be kept confidential, I think that that's a request that needs to be respected. Victims get to control when and how and where their allegations get made public. Now, if we want to look at all the things that went wrong in this process, there are many. There are many process issues that need to be addressed, but I think Senator Feinstein respected the wishes of her constituent, and that was the right thing to do.
And does Professor Ford feel that way as well?
Absolutely.
President Trump, I'm sure you saw, mocked your client's testimony at a rally in Mississippi on Tuesday night. The crowd, who are obviously big Trump supporters, applauded. Did you speak to Professor Ford? Did she see that? And what was her reaction?
She did. She was upset by it. It was very hurtful, as it would be to any woman, any survivor who had the courage to come forward, only to be mocked and belittled by anyone, really, but certainly by the President of the United States. It was very upsetting. It was very hurtful.
So one of the things that has gotten Republicans really enraged is the fact that during her testimony, Professor Ford told the committee that she wasn't clear that there was an offer to you, her legal team, from the committee to have the committee fly out to California and have a private conversation with her, interview with her, as opposed to flying her for a public hearing. Is that true?
No. We, as her counsel, informed her of all options made available to us by the committee. We showed her all of the correspondence. And what they were offering was to send staffers to California to interview her. Dr. Ford wanted to speak to the committee members themselves. And I think what you saw in the hearing was that Dr. Ford got a little confused and thought that Senator Grassley was suggesting that he himself would have come to California, which was not what he had offered at all.
The allegation that they're making very blatantly is that she has lawyers, you two, who are Democrats, who wanted to have a public spectacle.
Dana, that is such a ludicrous accusation. We've been listening to it, and we have not wanted to respond to it because it's such a distraction and deflection. Our client was advised of every single option given to her by the committee. She saw every single communication. She's a smart woman. She wanted to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee, not speak to members of his staff.
If Judge Kavanaugh becomes Justice Kavanaugh, or even if he stays on the federal bench he's on now, would Professor Ford like impeachment proceedings to begin?
Professor Ford has not asked for anything of the sort. What she did was to come forward and testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee and agree to cooperate with any investigation by the FBI. And that's what she sought to do here.
So no, she's not going there on impeachment?
No.
She does not want him to be impeached?
No.